So welcome to everybody. Today's call is going to be information intensive. It's a foundational call to just give everyone the background information so we all have an idea of what we're talking about. And then I'm going to be following it up very soon with two separate calls, one for parents and one for staff at Sudbury's and other facilities. We're separating it because to really dive into what needs to be done to accommodate PDA, it's quite different for a parent and for a staff member. So if you are interested at the end of this call, I'll send out a doodle for each. For some of you, it is the case that both apply, in which case you're very welcome on both calls. So I'm going to leap right into lecturing you, I'm afraid. Stop me if you need to, otherwise I'll definitely make space for questions at the end. I'm just going to get some slides to help me keep my track. Right. Oh, looks like I've started at the end. I'm not the greatest tech wizard. There we go. So SDE for PDA, self-directed education for pathological demand avoidance. I believe that self-directed education is really ideal for PDA, and I believe that PDA helps self-directed educators get to gold standard, and I'll explain why. So let's first look at what PDA is. So we've got our official terminology, which is pathological demand avoidance. Now I'm just going to briefly drill in there. So we also have something else called demand avoidance, and you can have autism spectrum with demand avoidance. This is different to PDA. So essentially rational demand avoidance means there's a reason I don't want to do the thing. Maybe I don't want to brush my teeth because I don't like the taste of the toothpaste. I don't like the feel of the toothbrush. It's a bad time. I'm in the middle of a movie. I don't like the way the bathroom smells. These would all be rational demand avoidance, in that if we solve the issue, the demand avoidance can go away. Pathological demand avoidance is where the demand itself is part of the problem. The fact that it is a demand makes it difficult to comply. So that's why pathological demand avoidance, also because it really impacts the life of the person who is the PDA and everybody around them. It makes it very difficult to get an ordinary day done unless you can get to a place where you can deal with the demand rather than just all of the other reasons why something's not able to happen. Now, Harry Thompson is a PDA who reframes everything very positively and very beautifully. And he likes to call it a pervasive drive for autonomy. That when the PDA is able to follow their own flow 100% and nobody's putting any demands and they can actually find their own way, then that's when life starts to really become doable. And they just, the moment that there's any kind of imposition or attempt to coerce or manipulate, or any attempt to go out of what he calls the flow and do something that's not in flow, that's where things get really difficult to achieve. Personally, I like to call it perceived demand anxiety. And I'm going to go into that in more detail in a minute. But one of the things I like about perceived demand anxiety is it helps me to explain the flip sides of the coin. So often you see, for example, on the Facebook parenting groups, people who are fairly new to this going, hang on a sec, but they're making demands of us. I thought they're supposed to avoid demands, but here they are being very demanding. And they're not avoiding the demands of, for example, the demand to get a new pair of the latest fashion boots. They're embracing that demand and they're making it into an obsession. What's going on? This is called demand avoidance. So demand avoidance is only half of what happens, because the point is it's perceived demand anxiety. The moment that something is perceived to be a demand, whether or not it was intended as a demand, it flares up anxiety, and that anxiety creates a need to be in control. So I then split that into paralytic demand aversion. I'm still looking for the perfect terminology. I keep playing. I like my words. So paralytic demand aversion, in terms of it's paralyzing and it gives you an aversion to the demand. So the more I tell you, you have to brush your teeth right now, because otherwise, the more you're likely to get paralyzed into not being able to do it, and actually developing an aversion to that particular kind of demand, that now tomorrow you won't be able to brush your teeth either. And the flip side of that would be what I like to call perfectionistic demand attraction. So now that there's a demand and my anxiety is flaring and I've got this need to control, I now can't let go of fulfilling this demand, and it has to be done perfectly. So it has to be exactly those boots. It can't be anything else, or I have to make my bed exactly like this. And this is where it starts looking a bit like OCD, except there's some important differences between this and OCD. Not that I know a lot about OCD, but from the bit I know about it, there's some important differences. So, for example, the shape of what has to be done on the bed every day doesn't stay as consistent as it would with OCD, because the issue is actually the anxiety-driven need to control. And if it becomes too much of a demand to do it in a particular way, then it will shift into a slightly different form. So it seems paradoxical, but the attraction and the perfectionistic kind of obsession about a demand is the flip side of the demand aversion, because they're both strategies of the control that can reduce anxiety by creating a false sense of autonomy. If we come back to Harry's definition there, when we don't feel autonomy, we can go for control instead, and it can help reduce the anxiety, even if it's not necessarily as nourishing. So to briefly also point out, that the original official definition I see as very much coming from a place of a privileged outside view that's got an agenda of compliance. So pathological demand avoidance is what I, as a non-PDA, would see this as, because I want the person to do the thing and they won't do the thing. And I'm demanding of them and they are avoiding doing the thing. And that's a problem for me. So that's how I'm going to label it, as pathological demand avoidance. But it doesn't really take into account the inside view. So an insider experience, Harry's experience, would be pervasive drive for autonomy. And his agenda, rather than an agenda of compliance, would be one of maybe emancipation. I don't know. I would hate to put words in his mouth, but that's my guess. That's my perception. My agenda is one of facilitative insight. I like this definition because it helps me explain to people who are trying to support PDAs how to do it. And that's why I like using these definitions. So control is what happens when safety feels threatened. So essentially, this anxiety is putting the PDA into a fight, flight, freeze spectrum of states. So physical safety is threatened, but also psychological safety, including competence, autonomy, relatedness, and dignity. Now, in other parts of my work, I go a lot into these needs. And yeah, hopefully everybody can relate to it enough without me having to go over all of that. But when we threaten someone's sense of competence, or we threaten their sense of autonomy, or relatedness is disrupted and isn't going well, or somebody feels that their dignity is not being supported in a circumstance, that can feel as threatening as physical safety. Any burning questions so far, or can I carry on to the next slides? Everybody good? Right, going to continue. So with pathological demand avoidance, we've got an anxiety-driven need to stay in control that's causing a problematic relationship with demands. So there can be an inability to meet ordinary, simple demands when stressed. And when stressed is an important point here, because people can say, but this kid managed this yesterday, no problem. Why can't they do it today? And now they couldn't do it yesterday, but they can do it today. What's going on? And this is also where in different circumstances, but when this kid is over here, they manage it. When they're over here, they don't. There's a number of things that can feed into that, including masking, which is beyond the scope of this call, unfortunately. But one of the things is when stressed. So when somebody is relaxed, if we think of ourselves, everybody, PDA or non-PDA, every human, when we are not stressed, we can manage things that we cannot manage when we are stressed. And so when we support the PDA in keeping their stress levels low and the demands low, they become more and more capable of actually doing what they want to do. But when there is stress, then even if there's an active desire to do the thing, and even if there are strong incentives to do the thing, that can actually make it harder to do. And this is where we get the discontinuity with other neurotypes. So with most neurotypes, we can incentivize the person to do the thing, and that will make the difference. With PDA, that can absolutely backfire. When we start offering rewards or offering explanations of why, or especially creating anxiety around what will happen if you don't, then we actually have just made it much, much harder to do the thing. I like to say, I like to use a very visual example of tipping someone out of their wheelchair. If you start actually trying to motivate a PDA to do the thing. And this is something that's a habit that works with many other neurotypes. And so a lot of us might use that as a first resource. And that's one of the key things we need to learn not to do with PDA. So the flip side being the inability to let go of a demand when stressed, even if there's an active desire to do so, and even if there are strong incentives, they can actually, instead of motivating the person, result in a closer grip on that demand. So when something is perceived as a demand, even if other people don't intend it as a demand, even if other people can't see how it could be perceived as a demand, anxiety flares up. And the higher the level of background anxiety or pressure, the more likely that something will be perceived as a demand. And this is what makes things unpredictable. Anxiety escalates to trigger the fight, flight, freeze reactions, which can appear in many different ways. There's lots of different theorists busy adding F's to the list. So aggression, being violence in physical or verbal, is usually the one that gets the most attention and that people are most worried about. But then evasion and excuses, what seems to be procrastination or zoning out, loss of bodily control. There's a sort of a belief that PDAs say their legs don't work when they don't want to go somewhere, but my perception is that there is actually an experience of my legs don't work when I feel too anxious to do the thing. The masking takes the form also with the friending, sometimes helplessness and puppeteering, wanting other people to do it for me. Fawning, which would be where you think that the person is complying or managing, whereas actually so much energy is going into to creating the perception that they're complying or managing, that learning isn't retained. And there's usually quite a fallout in terms of stress and distress afterwards. It can even be to the level of trauma, which is where, unfortunately, to just briefly say, as I said, masking is beyond the scope of discussion here because it's quite complex, but we can see situations where people say, oh, but this child is absolutely fine at school all day. What do you mean they've got PDA? But when they get home, the family is seeing what it cost for the child to keep up that level of faking it, basically. Because it's coming from the same place as when you say, yes, sir, I love your shoes, because there's a gun at your head if you don't say that. It's coming from the same kind of place, and it can generate the same kind of trauma. Right, so very, very briefly from other parts of my work, the key problem for PDA at this point in history is that we are all in a kind of a vertical culture. Colonial invaders took over the whole of the world. And the vertical culture focuses on obedience. And basically the person with more status and more power gives instructions to the person below, who sends them down the chain of command. And we're expected to comply with whatever came from above. And generally, pre-colonial cultures have a lot more of a horizontal structure. And this is also really what we need for PDA. So a horizontal interaction would be more cooperative. There would be more genuine intimacy, more genuine vulnerability, more bonding, and it's egalitarian. And this is what PDA is going to be the most comfortable with. So the moment that there are cues that we are in a situation that is vertical, that's going to flare up the anxiety. And ironically, it's going to kick PDA expressions into being very vertical, because somebody coming in there, the need for control generates vertical behavior. Together with that, the great myth of the vertical culture is that everything breaks down into there being a persecutor, a rescuer, and a victim. So the moment that something goes wrong, we identify who is the wrongdoer and how can we stop them from wrongdoing to the victim? How can we rescue the victim from the wrongdoer?
Like a weapon, I think.
Sorry, somebody unmuted there. Was that a question or just an accident? Okay. And when we give a PDA the cue that we are in a vertical situation and we are in the Karpman drama triangle, then they are often going to be pushed into appearing to take the persecutor role. And we see a lot of complaining from people who don't understand PDA, and basically saying that PDAs are abusers. So this is something that's very, very important to understand, that this triangle is a myth, and that if we can step out of this triangle into more of a horizontal type of relating, where nobody has to be identified as the perpetrator, but we can rather look at, we have a problem to solve, and everybody has a part to play in generating the problem and solving the problem. That's why I say that I think PDA has helped the rest of us go to gold standard, because even very, very subtle levels of coercion and vertical culture will trigger anxiety for the PDA, which is where they become a kind of a canary in the coal mine. So if you've just joined us, we're just screeching through some information here, and we'll be getting to some questions time soon to get clearer. So from a purely educational perspective, multitasking is a very poor way to learn. So I like to think of being in a mech suit, and you're trying to learn how to control this kind of big robot body that you're inside of. You know, you have to figure out, how do you make the arm move? How do you make the fingers happen? How do you talk? How do you walk? And you don't want to do that while trying to memorize a soliloquy from Shakespeare. It's not going to happen. So for PDA and for many other neurotypes, the educational experience can be very, very difficult, because at the same time that they're trying to learn and explore and do something, they're also having to learn how to navigate the social situation and all of the aspects that are there that are challenging. And for PDA, they're also having to learn how to navigate the feeling of demand. So the moment that we add demand in any way, any kind of coercion or duress or manipulation or pressure or expectation on top of an educational situation, now our PDA is really stuck, because they have to choose. I can either focus on coping with the demand, or I can engage with the thing that I'm doing. Very, very difficult to do both. So I like to say that we need to support the PDA by supporting them in managing the learning, how to manage the PDA separately from trying to learn other things. So while the PDA is trying to learn and engage with something, we want to keep demands to the absolute, complete, total minimum, so that they can focus on what they're trying to learn. And there's another time and place to actually support with learning the self-management of dealing with PDA itself. So this is also going to play out in terms of the home and facility balance. You'll often find a lot more support for the PDA at home to learn how to deal with the PDA, so that the PDA can focus on making the most of the learning space. But then in order for that to happen, the learning space also needs to be able to accommodate the PDA, so that the PDA demands are out of the way as much as possible, so that the child can explore and make the most of it. So very, very briefly, huge condensation. We need to build safety so that the PDA can self-manage and keep calm. We need to support a subjective sense of competence. So we respect their decisions. We do not offer unsolicited advice or feedback, because that undermines a sense of competence. We support autonomy by reducing demands, reducing impositions, respecting choices, collaborative problem solving and win-win solutions rather than impositions. We support relatedness by being horizontal and respectful, and particularly at home, we can use love languages also to help just build this. We need to support dignity, to be humble and egalitarian, humble being knowing that I don't know, rather than assuming that I do, and offer help with an attitude of solidarity rather than charity. Also taking them at their word as to what it is that they might need. So this is also why, again, I come back to saying that I believe that PDAs help facilitators reach a gold standard. Because if you look at what we're trying to do, particularly in something like a Sudbury, there's very good reasons why we really emphasize autonomy. We really support the child doing whatever they choose with their time, without being seduced off or sort of pressured off, or taken off into what we think would be better for them to be doing. We support a subjective sense of competence. We don't go around evaluating people in Sudbury. We don't offer unsolicited feedback to tell someone that they could be doing better, for example. And relatedness aspects are really, really strong. There's a strong sense of community, a strong egalitarian culture, where we've got mutual respect. It's actually quite nice for a PDA to be in a place where there isn't this adults is always the power and authority, because for PDA that feels completely unnatural. One of the quickest ways that little PDAs are spotted is because they just don't recognize adults as having any special authority, and they will challenge it and challenge it hard. And the little PDAs in conventional education often do best when the teacher takes them on as a teaching assistant, for example. So it's a very, very natural environment for a PDA to come into a Sudbury space. But at the same time, to the extent that we might not be supporting autonomy quite as much as we think we are, or we might be subtly undermining someone's sense of competence without realizing it, we can get away with that with the other kids. The PDAs will show us right what we're doing, which can be a hell of a challenge and an amazing opportunity. So this is just a paste straight from the PDA Society. This is usually what's recommended for dealing with PDA, is to change your language. For example, I wonder if we can, or let's see if, or I can't see how to make this work. Shall we see if we can beat the clock? Maybe we could investigate, who do you want to help us today? And avoid saying things like, it's time for you to, or you've got to, or you need to, or you must. So changing what you say, how you say it is useful, can be very useful. However, it's really not enough, because the issue issue is why you're doing it, why you're saying what you're saying, and what your attitude is when you're saying it. So a phrase I use all the time is attitude before strategy, because any words can be weaponized. Weaponized meaning you are using this manipulatively to meet your own agenda, as opposed to using this indirect language supportively to assist the PDA in keeping anxiety low enough to be able to do what they want to do. So again, you'll see people wailing and moaning, not knowing why it's not working, because we're using the perfect language and we're phrasing it indirectly. But the fact that that adult has an attachment to the PDA doing X, and they are now using this indirect language to get the PDA to do X. PDA is a very, very perceptive neurotype. Sees straight through the bullshit. It's one of the strengths, one of the superpowers. And if you are using PDA strategies to get the PDA to comply with your agenda, that's an extra layer of demand. So we actually, again, it challenges us to investigate our own agendas and see if we've really dropped them, because we need to be supporting the PDA with this language. So it's like, I'm using this language so that I don't unnecessarily stress you out. Again, it's like not tipping over the wheelchair. That's why I need to use this language, not because it might help me get my way. So again, very briefly, one of the reasons why there's such a good fit between self-directed approaches and PDA. Most schools have these things here, but most SDE settings have a lot less of them. And these things affect the safety and anxiety balance. So most schools, most educational approaches have absolute demands, uniformity, fixed expectations, imposed routines, obedience, punishment, needing to get permission for things, strong adult-child authority hierarchy, a very formal and stiff environment, imposed academic goals, lots of arbitrariness, double standards, blame, shame, fitting in, measuring up, high stakes, and pathologization rather than appreciation for diversity. On the other hand, many of the things that help with PDA that aren't around in most schools but are quite prominent in most SDE settings that increase safety and reduce anxiety, support for competence in terms of empowerment and opportunities to be responsible, lots of play, lots of flexibility, lots of ability to escape and take time out, lots of opportunities for self-care and following personal flow, lots of novelty and spontaneity, because PDA doesn't do well with routines, because any routine starts feeling like a demand. There's lots of support for autonomy, individual self-expression, freedom, uniqueness of identity is supported and respected. They're in charge of their own time and energy. They've got their own priorities and agendas, and that's supported. Relatedness is very high with small groups, lots of collaboration, lots of freedom of association, which is so important to not be stuck with the person who's triggering you. Transformational justice is very, very helpful. And that's one of my interests, is also looking at transformational justice and collaborative problem solving. And there's also a very homey environment. It's very relaxed. It's like a house with a lounge, with a couch, rather than desks in rows. And then big one, dignity, that there's actually equality regardless of age, and an appreciation of diversity rather than pathologizing and labeling some people as sick or broken. And there's also often a different level of acceptance for stims and self-regulation, which is quite important, to not mock people for their ways of keeping themselves steady. So for me, these two quotes really fit together quite beautifully. Harry Thompson, PDA extraordinaire. We're not imposing our will, we're fostering freedom. And Daniel Greenberg, what's important to us is what the students want to take, not what the teachers want to give. And I'm going to stop there now, because there's so much more I could say about PDA. And I don't know what it is that you want to know. Just to repeat one more time that we will be taking this forward into 2 more calls, one specifically for supporting parents and one specifically for supporting people who are facilitating. So some of the things that you ask now, we might table over to those calls, but now's your chance and go for it.